just start.
Okay.
And if they show up, they show up, and if they don't show up, they don't show up. Thank you all for coming. My name is Louis Frumkes, for those of you who don't know me. Christopher Mason is a remarkable talent, a freelance writer, editor, and performer with multiple skills that he offers for hire. He writes and performs amusing musical toasts and roasts in person or in videos. He writes and edits articles and books. He was the host of Behind Mansion Walls, a weekly series on the Investigation Discovery TV channel about murder in fabulous houses, and has also written cheerful obituaries celebrating well-lived lives. Michael Korda, the longtime editor-in-chief of Simon & Schuster, thanked Christopher for performing at his 90th birthday celebration. He said, quote, "You were brilliant, clever, inventive, to the point, funny, but affectionate. I've heard nothing like it since I last listened to Noel Coward singing 'Let's Do It' in Las Vegas, Cole Porter songs, but with lyrics of Noel's own wildly inventive imagination." Suffice that Christopher is not typical of the guests I usually invite here, and I probably should have asked him to perform for you. Instead, I have suggested he tell you a little about his life and how he became the loved character that he is among New York society. Is there someone else coming? Otherwise, we're starting. Christopher?
Sure. So thank you everyone for coming to this intimate gathering. And we're informal here, so if you have any questions, please feel free to speak up. So my journey to becoming a writer was kind of extremely quirky, a lot of hard work, a lot of crazy twists and turns, and some outrageous lucky breaks that propelled me from one kind of writing to another. So I grew up in Cambridge, England, which is famous for its university, which is 800 years old, and it's spawned all these famous writers. More recently, sort of Zadie Smith, Nabokov, and Salman Rushdie. And I grew up in this nice, normal, middle-class family. My mother and father were saints, just lovely people. And I'm sure I drove them crazy. And I was so aware of this great literary legacy of Cambridge, where all these famous writers had walked. But I was a kind of, in Cambridge, you were either town or gown, because the students all had to wear gowns to go to their tutorials. So I was a townie, but I was so fascinated by the beauty of these magnificent buildings, some of them sort of 400, 500, 600 years old, including the famous King's College Chapel, which has this famous choir. So I was completely fascinated by this tradition, but I wasn't really part of it. And my lovely parents were very hardworking, and there were hardly any books in the house. And one year we took a family vacation to Bath, beautiful 18th century city. And on the way back, we stopped in Oxford, which, like Cambridge, has all these beautiful, imposing buildings and quads. They're called at Oxford, and they call them courts at Cambridge. So we were walking around, and I knew I always wanted to be a writer, but I had no idea of what kind of writer I really wanted to be. And I said to my parents, "Oh God, I'd love to go to Oxford or Cambridge. It'd be so amazing." And my mother said, "Oh, I'm so sorry, darling, but you know, you have to be very clever to get into Oxford or Cambridge." And I just thought, I was enraged. I figured she was probably right, but I was just so determined to get into Cambridge and to become a writer. And so my parents very kindly were willing to pay for me to go to a private school where I would get an excellent education. And I stupidly refused. and I wound up at this really nasty school. It was just vile. There was no kind of academic prowess or anything like that, and I felt like a freak. And I was gay, so I was teased mercilessly. So I kind of hid myself. And with my lovely parents, my mother saying, "You're not clever enough to get into Cambridge or Oxford," I was just so determined. And I rebelled against my lovely parents by becoming a voracious reader. And I read 18th century novels, I read ancient philosophy, modern philosophy, all the great poets, and just became immersed in this world. And then I went to a high school, and they told me they thought, sorry, I wasn't clever enough to get into Oxford or Cambridge. So I couldn't stay for the extra year you had to attend to get into Oxford or Cambridge. So again, I was outraged and just determined. And so I studied like crazy, and miraculously I got in. My grades weren't particularly good, but I managed to wing it in the interview. And thank God. And then I was really at Cambridge, and I spent all my time being inside the beautiful buildings I'd only seen from the outside up to that point. And then, so what was I going to say? So I also, I was enthralled by the writings of Oscar Wilde, the Irish poet and playwright, and I sort of admired his wit and verbal dexterity. And in England, there's a famous duo, 19th century duo called Gilbert and Sullivan, and they wrote all these operettas, and my mother was a local opera star, so I saw her in all of these little operettas, and all these very witty songs, and some of them were called patter songs, and they go at incredible speed, and you have to really keep up on the edge of your seat to hear what they're saying, because it's funny and you don't want to miss anything. So that made a real impression on me. So once I got into Cambridge, I studied English and history of art, and I am so grateful for that experience, because I was recently diagnosed with ADD, and my head kind of spins and is all over the place unless I have an assignment. But I had to write 2 essays a week, and it just drilled into me the discipline of reading, studying, putting together notes, thinking of an original twist to put on the material. And I'm so grateful for that experience, because it's helped me my whole life ever since. So when I graduated from Cambridge, England was in the middle of yet another economic downturn. And a friend who hadn't got into Oxford or Cambridge and was so humiliated, because everyone thought they were clever enough to get into Oxford and Cambridge, that he moved to New York and started working as a TV producer. And so he invited me to come and stay with him. And New York was so exciting at that moment. Major nightclubs, and we were out all night dancing, and it was just peak New York downtown fun. And I had this list of people to look up. So I was out for sort of breakfast, lunch, and cocktails and dinners, meeting all these interesting people. And I had just had a stash of $20 bills in my suitcase, and it was the bed was pushed up against the closet. So I just put my hand in every morning and reach for some 20s and go out and have fun. And then one terrible morning, I woke up, and there were no more 20s left, and I had to get a job. So I applied for this job with this guy called George Tresher, who was a brilliant fundraiser and PR guy. And he raised money for the New York Public Library, the Botanical Garden, all these great New York institutions. And he was very close friends with 3 of the most powerful women in New York at that point. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, and Liz Smith, who was a syndicated columnist all over the country, and then Mrs. Astor, the queen of New York society at the time. And so these were three of the most dynamic, brilliant women, and they knew how all the levers of power operated in New York. And so we would plan these charity balls, and the Municipal Art Society was one of them. And I had to sign my name something like 2,000 times. I had to sign not my name, but Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. So people would think they were being personally invited by Jackie. And it was also a time when there were all these overnight billionaires, and it was the rise of people like Donald Trump and Ivana Trump. And there was a lot of sort of parading of wealth, and people wanted to be all these ladies wanted to be made the honorary or the chairman of a charitable event. And it was the height of the AIDS crisis, and these ladies were just fiercely competing to be the chairman of these benefits. And they would fly to Paris on the Concorde to get their outfits ready for it. Just seemed so grotesque and so crazy, and such a waste of money, that I started writing songs about these people, poking fun at them. And I just performed them for my friends. And then one day my boss fired me and said, "You're very good at having, breakfast with Mrs. Astor and tea with Mrs. Onassis to talk about these things, but you're wasting your time. You're not really good at this. But I've heard these songs you're writing. They're very funny, and you should become a songwriter and performer." So that was kind of terrifying because I didn't know where to begin. But I got hired to perform at the New York Public Library, and there were 1,600 people there, and the crazy guy who had asked me to do it, Mario Bawat, who was a famous decorator, and he put a loudspeaker in the front hall so that when 1,600 people walked into the New York Public Library, they heard me singing, poking fun at all these people in New York society. And suddenly it became a big deal, and there were newspaper articles about me and magazine articles about my songs poking fun at the rich and powerful. And I was obsessed with the songs of Cole Porter and Noel Coward, who was the English kind of equivalent of the brilliant Cole Porter, and Tom Lehrer, who was a math professor at Harvard, and he was writing these brilliant, acerbic songs, ridiculing, talking about pollution, how everything was going to hell with pollution, people weren't paying attention to it. And then he did a song poking fun at the Catholic Church. And there was a song he had called The Vatican Rag, and it went like this. First you get down on your knees, fiddle with your rosaries, bow your head with great respect, and genuflect, genuflect, genuflect. You can do just what you want if you have cleared it with the pontiff. Ave Maria, it's going to see you doing the Vatican Rag. So it was that kind of really irreverent stuff. And overnight, I performed for Ivana Trump on her yacht. And that was in the day when it was respectable to have anything to do with Donald and Ivana Trump. So it was a while ago. And anyway, so I just wound up flying around the country, being hired to poke fun at people. Anyway, so I was doing a lot of this. And I became friends with the filmmakers Merchant and Ivory. They made all these famous films, Howard's End and Maurice, and they were all played at the Paris Theatre, which is still there on 59th Street by the Plaza Hotel. and they hired me to write a song about their latest successful movie, Howard's End, and it was a ballroom full of people celebrating this new movie, but also the Paris Theatre, which is, I don't know if you know it. Have you anyone been to the Paris Theatre? It's a beautiful theatre, 58th Street, right by Bergdorf Goodman. It's a beautiful place. And the Lowe's Corporation just bought it, and they had changed it from the Paris Theatre to the Lowe's Fine Arts. And Merchant and Ivory, Ismail Merchant, they were just horrified by this change because all of their movies had launched at the Paris Theatre. So as a chaser to my song about Howard's End, I did a song about this change of the name of the cinema across the street. And it went like this. It was, we love the Paris for the movies. Now it's changed to Lowe's Fine Arts. We miss the Paris, our favorite movie palace. And then the end was, fine art sounds more like Hackensack. Why can't we have the Paris back? And with that, I got a standing ovation. It was a thrilling moment. And Sir Ian McKellen was there, and Dame Irene Worth were there at my table. And I sat down, everyone was applauding, I was feeling really pleased with myself. And then this guy stood up and said, excuse me, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Bernie Leventhal. I am the president of the Lowe's Film Corporation. I was not amused by that song. Let me tell you something about the Lowe's Corporation. And he started talking about the virtues, and people were getting bored. And Dame Irene Worth, who had really been enjoying the champagne, banged her fist on the table, and she said, "Bring back the piano player!" And so this was a really good moment. Unfortunately, someone was there from the New York Times, and that Sunday it made it into the New York Times quoting my song. And Ismail Merchant was walking from his apartment to his office on 57th Street, and he walked past the Lowe's Fine Arts, and to his amazement, there were guys on a ladder putting back the sign for Paris. And Ismail said, "Oh my God, Christopher, this is the power of song, the power of song." And then he told me that they were looking for a venue for the next movie, and which was about to film, and it starred the famous French actress Jean Moreau, and Sam Waterston, and Nell Carter, the magnificent, very large lady who starred in Ain't Misbehavin' on Broadway. And it was a great cast, and it was very exciting. And so I was living in this beautiful apartment, which strangely is just across the street. It's 131 East 66th Street. And it's a beautiful building. And I was friends with an elderly couple. The husband died, the wife was lonely and asked me to move in. And it was an incredible apartment. There was a double height living room. I mean, it was magnificent. And there was a Chinese butler, Mr. Wu, who used to bring a tray when I was sitting at the piano writing songs, poking fun at people in this beautiful double height room. He would bring a tray with my lunch, and I just thought, this cannot be happening. This is not my life. I came from a kind of nice but modest background, and here I am being fed by a Chinese butler in this fancy apartment. And so the first day of filming, I'd been to the gym, I rushed back, and they had assured us that there would be minimal disruption in this fancy building, which had it was a co-op building. And you could only pay cash to get in. It was one of those buildings. And it had, and the doorman, and there was a manual elevator with a guy who wore white gloves. And so it was pretty fancy. And the guy, on the first day, the guy said, "You've got a lot of people up there." I just counted 27 people. And then he said, "I think the people on the board of the building are really unhappy because there was a huge cable that went all up the side of the building, and there was a huge truck parked on 66th Street for the lights and AC. And so the building was furious, and they were trying to shut down the production of the movie. It was in production. We were filming, it was all going well. And they sent a lawyer, the board sent a lawyer with a cease and desist letter. And this merchant was calling the White House. He was trying to get them to stop so we can continue filming. But it turned out, it really was turned out. And we came back the next morning for the final scene to be shot. And I was in the lobby with the superintendent of the building, and they were having this huge screaming match. And the super had been told by the board no one was allowed to come in from the film, that it was not happening. And so Nell Carter, it's a beautiful African-American actress, arrived, and she tried to get in the building, and they said, sorry, you can't come in. And she turned around, and we were opposite St. Vincent's Church, and there's a nunnery in there. So all these nuns lived in the church building, and they saw Nell Carter coming out of the building, and they ran over to ask for her autograph. And these very sophisticated Manhattan nuns who went to great Broadway shows and wanted an autograph of the big star. And so she said, well, who's stopping this? She was talking to the nuns, and she said, why is this happening? Why are they not letting us film here? And these very sophisticated nuns said, oh, that's a very fancy co-op board. It's a co-op building. They have very fancy rules. And Nell Carter said, well, who's in charge here? And I said, well, actually, that's the chairman of the board right there. That's his apartment. And it was summer, and the windows were open, and he had a little balcony. And Nell Carter said, hell, I'm going to just give him a little show. And she broke into her Tony Award-winning dance routine from Ain't Misbehavin'. And the nuns were going like this, and I was telling a friend about this, and she said, this is too fun, this is too crazy, all this stuff. You should write it down. So I called a friend at New York Magazine. I said, this wild thing is happening. And he said, well, why don't you just write it up as a diary? And I can't promise you anything, but just send it to me. And it was the day of faxes, so I was feeding it into the fax. And to my delight and surprise, they accepted the article, they cut 10 words, they didn't change anything, and they put it on the cover of the magazine. And overnight, I was a journalist. And then I had a friend who had been a footman at Buckingham Palace, and he was starting a business in England trying to take wealthy Americans around the royal castles of Europe. And Mohammed Al Fayed, who had just bought the Duke of Windsor's house outside Paris, had given him permission to have Americans going through his house. And that's the house where Princess Diana and Dodi were heading when they didn't get that, or when it was the car crash, where Princess Diana died on the way to that house. And of course that happened much later. So I called a friend at the Times, and they said, do you think anyone at the Times would be interested? My friend wants to take Americans around the royal castles of Europe. And she gave me a number, and I called this number, and a woman answered, and she was roaring with laughter. And she said, I'm sorry, who's this? I said, oh, hello, my name's Christopher Mason. And she said, wait a minute, I'm reading your article in New York Magazine. It's fabulous. Do you want to come and write for me at the New York Times? And that's how it happened. And I hadn't been to journalism school or anything like that. I mean, I'm very grateful I had a good education from Cambridge, but I was thrown in at the deep end, but she really encouraged me. She believed in me, I guess. And she asked me to write, she enabled me to write all these long, big articles. And first one I did was about, I found there were all these properties in New York, the finest real estate in New York, being owned by 6 very rich guys, including Steve Jobs. They were buying these amazing houses, hiring the world's leading architects and designers to reconfigure them, and then they never moved in. This is such a bizarre phenomenon, and it's an another outrageous case of lavish, outrageous expenditure. So I wrote an article about it, and I compelled all these people to talk. And so that got a lot of attention. And the Times did wonderful things. They sent me to Russia to write about the overnight phenomenon of the discovery of interior design during the Soviet period, and after the fall of the war. There was no interior design in all of Russia, but as Russians started getting more money, it turned into an overnight phenomenon. So I got a chance to go to Russia and write about all this and meet all these extraordinary people. So I hope I'm not babbling too much, and please stop me if you have any questions. So I got to write all of it. So I was writing for the New York Times. I wrote for the New York Times for 17 years. And I also got to write for other magazines. And I was writing an article for New York Magazine about Sotheby's and Christie's, the 2 great auction houses that were founded in the 18th century in London. And it was the turn of the millennium. And I thought it's a really interesting time to be looking at these 2 respected auction houses and see how they're trying to reinvent themselves for the 21st century. And Christie's was moving to Park Avenue, to a former parking garage at Rockefeller Center, and now it's very opulent. But before it was a multi-story garage. And Sotheby's was staying put on York Avenue, but they were expanding from 2 floors to 10 floors, and it was the chairman of the board was Alfred Taubman, a wealthy guy from Detroit who had invented the luxury shopping mall. So the luxury shopping mall, as we know it in America, was his idea, and he developed it. And he was dyslexic, hopeless in school, but he had a brilliant sense of how people move through space. And so he designed these shopping malls so that when you kind of didn't know where the store began and where the pathway was. And he called it threshold resistance, because when he was a little kid and very poor in Detroit, he was working in a shoe store, and he noticed that people would come up to the store. It was one of those old-fashioned stores where it was glass like this, that it went in like that, and then the door was there. And he noticed this thing that people would come down the street, they'd look at the shoes, they'd be amazed by the shoes, then they'd look at the shoes on the other side, but they didn't cross the threshold. And he recognized this as a peculiar thing of human dynamics. And so he designed these shopping centers so that there was no sense of whether you were in a shop or whether you were on the way to a movie in the mall. It's very brilliant. So he made this huge fortune and bought Sotheby's. And he had hired this woman called Dee Dee Brooks, who had become the most powerful woman in the art world. And she was the CEO of Sotheby's. And she was kind of a magnificent woman, so gutsy, incredibly hardworking, driven, great vision for the company. And so that was Sotheby's. And then their arch rival was Christie's. And Christie's was a very different kind of thing. They were still based in London, and they were very snobbish. The people who worked there, the experts, were usually the second or third sons of aristocratic families who had incredible eye for the art. And then there were people who kind of ran the store, but they were always looked down on. And there was a guy called Christopher Davidge who had run the printing division of Christie's, and they brought him in to run the whole company because he was very smart and very savvy, had street smarts. But they looked down on him, and they called him the butler. And so, and then the chairman of Christie's was a very arrogant guy called Sir Anthony Tennant. So I was writing about this, how Sotheby's was trying to reinvent itself, and they were launching Sotheby's.com. So they were trying to take this 18th century auction house into the 21st century. And Sotheby's.com was a spectacular failure. They lost $100 million. But that's what happened. But Christie's was expanding hugely. And so I was writing this article about how they were reinventing themselves for the 21st century, when suddenly the Financial Times of London released this story on a Saturday morning saying that Sotheby's and Christie's, who were arch rivals, had secretly gotten together and agreed to fix the percentages on the commissions that they charged to sellers. And that was a revelation. It was a big deal. And the Justice Department had been following this for years, but it was going nowhere until someone spilled the beans. A jealous, angry dealer who felt he was being cut out of transactions at Sotheby's and Christie's. So suddenly, the direction of my story changed completely. And so I was writing about this fierce rivalry, this criminal investigation, and it wound up on the front cover of New York Magazine. And that was kind of amazing. And right after, I heard someone at the New York Times was planning to write a book about this. And a friend of mine was the daughter of Alfred Taubman, and she said, "You really should get in there. You should write this book. You know more about the art world than this person." So I wrote a proposal, and to my delight, I got the contract and got to write this book. But it required a level of research that I had no idea I was capable of. But I'd never been in a courtroom. I knew really nothing about business. But following this story required becoming an investigative journalist. So I did 2,400 interviews. There was a court case with Alfred Taubman, who was sent to jail at the age of 80. And so there were all these court documents, and it was a massive undertaking. And everybody involved had very scary lawyers. So I had to be meticulous in the way that I researched it all. And those 2,000, I know there were 2,400 interviews because they were all recorded, and I had them, or I was able to show the libel lawyer for the publisher that all my facts were triple checked. So that was an amazing experience. So I learned all about the law, I learned about business. I also learned about the subtle art of convincing people to talk who have no interest in talking to you. So with these four main protagonists, Dede Brooks, Alfred Taubman, Christopher Davidge, known as the butler at Christie's, and Sir Anthony Tennant, dramatically different characters. Dede Brooks, having worked for a public company, said that she would speak to me when the trial was over. Alfred Taubman PR person said that I could talk to him when the trial was over. But it was frustrating because I was gaining all this knowledge, but I wasn't allowed to interview any of the main characters. But I did an interview with subsequent chairman of Christie's, Lord Hindlip, who had a very mischievous side to him. And he said, do you know speaking of Christopher Davidge, he said, do you know that there's an astonishing thing about him that he has an ex-wife, a Russian model, and it was a very ugly divorce. And they have a child who had developmental problems, and she's very angry. And for a journalist, there's nothing better than an angry wife with an axe to grind with access to real information. So somehow I tracked her down, I got her telephone number, and I called and said, hello, my name's Christopher Mason, and I'm writing a book about the Sotheby's Christie's price fixing scandal, and I wonder if I could talk to you. And she said, no, I cannot talk to you. My ex-husband is a very dangerous man. I cannot talk to you. And I thought, so near, yet so far. I managed to track it down. I had the telephone number. I said, well, could I just ask you a few questions? And you can say yes or no, or maybe. So I started by asking her a few simple questions. I said, is it true that your husband worked crazy hours and he would get calls in the middle of the night? And she said, yes, it's true. And then I asked a few other softball questions. And then I just got a flash of inspiration. She told me that she and her husband were in the middle. They had been an ugly divorce, and they were, anyway, they were in the courts again. So they were fighting over child support. So I got this flash of inspiration, and I said, you know what's so crazy to me about this whole story is it's amazing that your ex-husband got away with so much money. And she said, really? And it turned out that he had finalized the divorce one day, and the next day he knew the company was being bought by Francois Pinault, the French multi-billionaire, and he knew his salary was going from £300,000 to 1.2 million. And he neglected to mention that to his wife when he divorced her. And now he was trying to withhold money for their poor, the special care required for their child. And so that was it. And then I said, well, can I ask you a few more questions? And then it was and it's golden information. So I learned that, she told me that when Christopher Davidge was a teenager in school, he wasn't good in school, and he left at 16, and he went to work selling shirts from a stall in the street. But he had incredible street smarts. But before he left school, he was about 15 or 16, and his best friend went home after school and found his mother dead with her head in a gas oven. She committed suicide, the father wasn't around. And so this poor boy ran to his best friend's house, and explained the whole thing and burst into tears. And Christopher Davidge's mother was very kind, and she took him in, invited him to live with them. But then it turned out after a few months, she was being extraordinarily kind, because it turned out that Christopher Davidge's mother was having a full-on sexual affair with his best friend, who was 15 or 16 at the time. And the relationship, she left her husband for her young lover, and I thought, that's a wild story, it's amazing. And then I went to an auction there was a black tie auction at Christie's, and Lord Hindlip, I ran into Lord Hindlip, and he said, did you get the Russian to talk? I said, oh my God, yeah, told me all this amazing information. And he said, "Oh, how marvelous! Did she sing like a canary?" I said, "Yes, she did like sing like a canary." But he was a big gossip, and within 12 hours, it was all over the international art world that Christopher Mason, the guy writing the book about Sotheby's and Christie's, spoke to Christopher Davage's ex-wife, and he got all this incredible material. And so Christopher Davidge reached out to a friend of mine who had been the editor of Art and Auction magazine and said, "How do I stop this guy? What can I do?" And he was refusing. I asked many times through his lawyers to speak to him, but he had no interest in speaking to me. So my friend said, "Well, what you should do is just give him an interview." But he had a non-compete thing, and anyway, in closing his very good deal when he left Christie's, he was not meant to speak to about any of the business of Christie's for over a year. But he was so desperate to stop me or to try and control the story that he agreed to do. I sent him 200 questions. I sent them to our mutual friend. She would then email them to him. He would answer them and send them to her, and she would send them to me. I don't know why he thought, no one would find out, because I had all the emails, copies of the emails between the two of them saying, "Let's do it like this." He'll send the questions. Anyway, so that was all happening. Oh, I forgot a rather important part of the little part of the story, which was that after he said, just before Lord Hendon said, "Oh, how marvelous, did she sing like a canary?" I managed to get the telephone number of Christopher Davage's mother, and I called her and she said, "Hello." I said, "Hello, my name's Christopher Mason, and I'm writing a book about the Sotheby's Christie's price fixing scandal, and I wonder if I could ask you a few questions about your son." And she said, "No, I can't talk to the press. No, absolutely, no." So again, I tried the tactic. Would it be okay if I asked you a few questions and you could say yes or no? And she said, "Okay." So I was asking some very softball questions, and I wasn't getting anywhere with her. So I just bit the bullet. I said, "Is it true that when Christopher was 15 or 16, his best friend headed the gas oven, you had a big affair with him?" And she said, "I refuse to discuss my private life," and slammed down the phone. And she didn't say it wasn't true. So that was kind of astonishing. So I was getting all this material. The one holdout was Sir Anthony Tennant, who went to Eton, served in the Guards, was very kind of top drawer, British aristocracy, and a mean guy in business. And I realized there was kind of no way I was going to be able to get to him. And then a friend of mine called and said that he was expecting to go to a country house party in England. It was going to be a 10-day house party over Christmas and New Year, and that I should come because Sir Anthony Tennant always came on Boxing Day, the day after Christmas, and there was a chance that I might be able to corner him. So I flew to England, stayed in this amazing house, and it was impossibly grand, with 2 butlers and a French chef and maids, and it was wild to be there. But I knew I had to try and get him to talk. So my bedroom was in the front of the house, and I was looking out, and I saw him and his wife arrive in a green Jaguar car, and it was snowing like crazy, and they took their 2 dogs out, 2 little miniature Dachshunds, adorable little dogs, and then put them back in the car. And I wanted to get a picture of them arriving. I had a new camera, but my hands were shaking so much, and I just couldn't get a picture. Yeah, and so I went downstairs trying to be calm. And the host, who knew that I was trying to get this information, said, "Oh, Anthony, you must meet Christopher Mason. He's dying to talk to you." And so I didn't know what to say. So I had a friend with me who was from the Guinness family, and they were making a special cocktail of Guinness and champagne, which is called Black Velvet. So I started, and he had been chairman of Guinness, so I started trying to have a conversation with him about Black Velvet, and he just wasn't interested. He just walked away. How the hell am I going to do this? And then at lunch, I was seated next to his wife, Lady Rosemary Tennant, and there was a French chef, and every meal there were 6 courses, and so in those kind of fancy situations, you have to turn to your right. If you're a gentleman, you have to talk to the lady on your right. Next course, you talk to the lady on your left. So I knew I had a few chances to talk to this lady, but first time she only wanted to talk about horses, and I know nothing about horses, so I didn't know how to try to manufacture some conversation. And she was very kind of clipped and English and very aware of being Lady Rosemary Tennant, and I knew I really wasn't getting anywhere with her. And then I talked to the lady on my left, and she was sitting next to the host, and she said, "He wants to know, are you getting anywhere? Are you getting anywhere with Lady Rosemary?" I said, "No, I don't want to talk about it." Third course, I had her on my right. All she wanted to talk about was dogs. And I love dogs, but I'm allergic to a lot of dogs. But I was trying to be really enthusiastic about dogs. And then I just thought, this is my moment. I'm probably not going to get another chance. I just bit the bullet and I said, it's so lovely staying here, and it's such a relief for me staying Hinton Ampner, this wonderful house, all the fantastic French chef, and all that's incredible, and so lovely. It's such a relief because I spent the last 2 years writing a book. And she said, "Oh really, what's it about?" I said, "Well, actually it's about the Sotheby's Christie's price-fixing scandal, and I'm dying to speak to your husband. He has said through his lawyers that he doesn't want to speak to me, but his colleagues at Christie's have told me so many terrible things about him. And I've spoken to the prosecutors in the Alfred Taubman case, and they have terrible things to say about your husband. I just want to give him a chance to tell his side of the story." And she said, "Write down your telephone number." So I did. And she said, "I hope you'll realize my husband will never talk to you." But then we went on to talk some more about dogs. And then she turned to me and she said, "Would you like to meet my dogs?" And I thought, okay. I really hoped I wasn't going to be allergic to them. So we went out into the snow, and there was a guy from London who'd come down who was playing Christmas carols on a big Steinway piano, and there was one of those Santas on the piano who kind of wiggled his bum and went ho ho ho, and it was this very kind of joyful Christmassy scene. And we went out into the snow, flurries of snow, and she opened the door, and these very cute dogs popped out, and she pointed at it and she said, "You can pick him up." So I picked up this dog. I just knew I was going to have a sneezing attack. And then she said, "You can stroke him." So I'm stroking the dog, whatever it takes. And then I guess she realized that the dogs liked me, so it was kind of okay. We went back into the house, and the guy's still playing the piano, and the fat Santa is still going ho ho ho. And there was some mistletoe, and people were kissing under the mistletoe. And in this very surreal setting, I tried to speak to Auntie Tennant, but I tried to, And I said, oh, Anthony, she said, oh, darling, this is Christopher Mason. He's writing a book about the whole Sotheby's Christie's thing. And he said, well, you must be mad. And I said, well, Sir Anthony, I've tried to reach you through your lawyers, but I haven't got anywhere. And he said, well, quite right. Never going to speak to you. And then he turned to his wife and said, okay, darling, let's go. And they started bolting for the front door. And I just thought, I've blown it so badly. But she took him into the living room and told him, darling, this is your last chance. This guy's going to write the book. It's your only opportunity to tell your side of the story. So he came back and looked at me very kind of coldly and said, what do you want to know? So I started describing particular documents in his handwriting that I'd seen in the court case. There was a specific date when he was meant to have met with Alfred Taubman and had an illegal conversation about colluding. And so he was trying to dismiss me. They say, well, that was nothing. It was. So I said, well, but do you remember that on the 3rd page of that memo, there was something you wrote? And he said, well, I think maybe we should speak. He said, here's my card. Call me tonight. So I took a calculated risk and I didn't call him. And I didn't call him for 48 hours. And I figured by this point, having heard from his wife, he would be desperate to speak to me. And sure enough, he was. My telephone rang. And he said, hello, it's Sandy Tennant here. Oh, so lovely to meet you the other day. And I wonder how I could help you. And he told me so much. I'd already written the book, but he gave me all this information that was mind-blowing. I had to go through the book, change lots of it, and change the ending of the book. And then it came out, and it was a huge success and bestseller, and a wonderful experience, and one hell of an odyssey. But basically, in short, that's how I became a writer. Sure, with pleasure.
Who's got questions for Christopher? Take a minute and think. If not, we can call it a day and thank you for a wonderful presentation.
Sure.
And thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
And if you'd like to purchase one of his books, they're over there. He would be happy to inscribe it to you.